If there's a single thing I've learned with my Final Fantasy VII video 2 years ago, Jesus Christ, it's that fans of a particular popular game will get mad and willfully misrepresent your statements out of pure spite and feel judged over the pettiest stuff possible, no matter how much you try to be clear and charitable and empathetic and, quite frankly, even repetitive. I suppose that's just how the internet works, especially nowadays with rage bait content driving engagement and being favored by all the algorithms big tech companies have successfully employed to basically every aspect of our lives in order to show ads. So, while I'll still be very much redundant and attempt to be as clear and as fair as I possibly can, let's get one thing out of the way right now. The premise of this video will piss people off, no matter how many times I stress over and over that this is just my personal opinion, obviously colored by my own biases and tastes, and it's more than okay to disagree, and my intention is not to judge or blame anyone for liking the subject matter. So I'll just drop my quote-unquote hot take now, and you can decide whether you want to stick around or not. Okay? Okay, here goes. I think The Last of Us is the death of creativity in video games, and it should have been a movie or a series from the start. You still here? Can you wait a little bit before furiously typing your comment that's longer than the video essay itself in all caps? Okay, let's elaborate. The Last of Us, in case you somehow don't know, is a multimedia franchise that started with a PlayStation 3 game released in 2013 and developed by Naughty Dog, followed by its sequel, The Last of Us Part 2 in 2020, and I shit you not, both games have somehow already received remasters, the first one getting one for the PlayStation 4 literally in the following year of its release, and another one at 2022. Part 2 only got remastered once so far, 4 years after its release. These games feature a cinematic style with a mature and gritty story not made for kids, and state-of-the-art realistic graphics. I also happen to think both these games are deeply uninspired, trope-infested slogs with shallow gameplay mechanics that are only there to justify these products as being interactive games when they, in fact, want to be prestige award-winning movies but are crammed into another medium. Despite these feelings of mine, these games became wildly successful, the first one in particular receiving near-universal praise from critics, and making Naughty Dog a lot of money, thus shaping the image of the company that used to make games like this to making games like this.
I'll see you on the other side.
It was clear where the money was at, so the second game received a gigantic budget by Sony, became one of the most expensive games ever made, and helped shape the image and expectations of Western game development, particularly blockbuster titles of mass appeal. Mature, gritty stories about groundbreaking and highly creative concepts such as, what if zombie apocalypse? Did you know that when society collapses with overwhelming violence, people are capable of doing ethically questionable things to survive? Maybe humans are the real monsters. Ooh, did you also know revenge is actually bad and violence tends to just lead to more violence? Okay, I'm obviously being a bit too tongue-in-cheek, and I admittedly have a bit of an axe to grind with The Last of Us. You see, the first game came out at a time where the exhausting and quite frankly xenophobic debate on which is better, Japanese or American games, was in full force, and I fully remember it being used as one of the quintessential examples of how Western game development was just much more modern, pioneering and better written than its Japanese counterpart, by making you hide from enemies in tall grass and slowly pick them apart one by one. In case it's not already obvious, I'm a weeb. My thing when it comes to games is usually JRPGs or otherwise other genres also coming from Japan. I am obviously unapologetically biased towards the usual Japanese sensibilities when it comes to game design, storytelling, execution and concepts, art style, etc. So if you want, you can easily and safely argue that my distaste for The Last of Us as a game franchise is entirely born from it just not being my personal cup of tea, and that's fair. But I also happen to enjoy American/European TV series and American movies, and like anyone living in South America, I'm not exactly a stranger to the usual tropes, gimmicks, and cultural sensibilities built at Hollywood, which is part of the reason why I can't, for the life of me, understand why these games, the first one in particular, are so beloved and became smash hits in the first place. Here's the premise. The apocalypse has occurred due to a malignant strain of fungus that turns people into blind zombies with super hearing. I don't care how much one may want to split hairs here about how they're different because they come from a fungal instead of a viral infection. For all intents and purposes, these are zombies. Joel, one of our protagonists, has traumatically lost his daughter during the initial outbreak and has done every ugly and vile thing necessary to survive ever since, ultimately becoming a smuggler of goods in a quarantine zone ruled by an authoritarian military regime called Fedra. Rising up against said regime are the Fireflies, a rebel militia who one day asks Joel to smuggle a 14-year-old girl called Ellie all the way to one of their hiding spots for undisclosed reasons, but an extremely high payout. Turns out, Ellie is immune to the disease, and due to circumstances like losing his longtime smuggling partner to this, Joel decides to honor his end of the bargain and trek with this preteen, who's just the age his daughter was when she died, all the way to their destination, which is the whole game. Obviously, both our leads bond like father and daughter, and again, obviously, whatever is waiting for Ellie at the Fireflies HQ is probably not very pleasant. Along the way, they meet some of Joel's old acquaintances, including his younger brother, who's surviving at a very stable and peaceful commune called Jackson, all the while hiding behind a bunch of balconies and tall grass, slowly picking apart enemies one by one in stealth kills because the game is designed so that you generally don't stand a chance in a direct confrontation. Here's where my petty complaints start. Aside from its ending, which legit caught me off guard and felt artistically riskier and opened up venues for a more interesting conversation and interpretation of the events, the whole game is about as cookie-cutter zombie plot as you get. Society has fallen, everything sucks, surviving is hard, and there's a bunch of assholes everywhere making you think the real monster may be humankind. You meet two brothers, you know one of them is going to get bitten, probably the youngest for maximum shock value, and there you go.
Shit, he's turning!
See this guy who looks very obviously suspicious? He's actually bad. And since he runs a settlement that's low on resources, I wonder what fucked up shit this heavily telegraphed creep does. Yep, he tricks his own people into eating human flesh. Maybe the real monsters are human, and like, that's fine. No piece of fiction needs to reinvent the wheel every time. There's an argument to be made about how strictly original ideas may not really exist anymore. It's enough to do what it sets out to do well, but God, it's so boring. Like, not even the slightest curveball. This is a game that came out during the tail end of the zombie craze. We all remember that, right? The period of time where the sheer amount of entertainment media involving zombies seemed to be all-encompassing, gathering sudden popularity despite the genre itself being fairly old by that point already. By 2013, we had like 3 seasons of The Walking Dead, World War Z, a bunch of Resident Evil films, 2 popular genre parody movies, Walking Dead Telltale games, Pride and Prejudice, and zombies, 3 Dead Risings, Left 4 Dead 1 and 2, an infinite number of Resident Evil 4 re-releases, not to mention that gloriously ridiculous scene from High School of the Dead, which I'm showing on screen for no reason other than it makes me crack up every time. I think it's fair to say zombie fatigue was a thing, and I really don't see what The Last of Us did to stand out from the pack. As for its actual gameplay, it was about as bare bones as I've come to expect from games that want to be movies. A linear and heavily scripted romp where you have to stop your progress to spend anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes hiding, getting the jump on enemies, rinse and repeat, interspersed with either long proper cutscenes or those sections where you're suddenly forced to walk slower through a given section so that the characters can have time to deliver their lines before a scripted sequence can begin. Because I guess people in general see this as more interactive and meaningful to the medium of video games rather than just, you know, making it a properly rigged cutscene. Nothing more fun than getting sometimes crucial plot information from this and also being forced to squeeze yourself into crevices so the game has time to load the following areas and claim that the days of loading screens are gone. Wow, just uninterrupted immersion. The game does have a crafting system, which basically means taking some of your time to inspect every room at a house so you can find strategically placed supplies to craft a few of the things in your arsenal, and sometimes you get a fatter and meaner zombie as either a difficulty increase or mini-boss. It did precisely one unexpected, artistically bold move in its ending. As was quite clear, it's Ellie's immunity that makes her valuable to the Fireflies, because they can make a cure out of her. They don't tell her the part about how, in order to do that, they need to extract the mutated fungus sample from her brain, necessarily killing her. Only Joel learns of this, of course, and he has grown grown very fond of Ellie and vehemently opposes it, going so far as to murder everyone at the facility in order to save her, effectively choosing his surrogate daughter over the rest of humanity. In the last scene, Joel is walking back to Jackson alongside Ellie, and she knows something doesn't add up. She asks him to swear on his version of the events, that there were a bunch of other immune people like her and they still couldn't figure out how to make a cure, so they gave up. Joel lies to her face, too afraid of what she might think of him by learning the truth. Ellie, despite looking like she knows deep down it's a lie, accepts his explanation and the game ends. That was genuinely great. A great moment that veers off expectations from a story of this genre, especially in 2013. Due to its massive success and prestige, of course Naughty Dog made a second one of the most expensive games ever made, through allegedly brutal periods of soul-crushing crunch, which were so bad Naughty Dog promised to never do it again, before apparently doing it again for its upcoming heretic whatever retro space game. Over $200 million for bleeding-edge mocap, extremely realistic and detailed graphics portraying all kinds of violence and dirt on everybody's faces, featuring yet another gritty and adult and mature story. Neil Druckmann, the series co-creator and artistic lead, said that if the first story was about what people are capable of doing for love, this one was about what they could do out of hate. It would feature larger explorable areas, enhanced and updated systems, all for the moody and cinematic game experience for mature audiences. And it's again, in my opinion, another extremely predictable plot about all the tropes we've come to expect not only from zombie stories but revenge plots as well. And again, it does exactly one bold, interesting artistic choice through the whole thing, but this time it's at the beginning and not the end. Joel and Ellie have been living on Jackson for quite a while, and for reasons that are revealed halfway through Ellie's story and at the very end, a rift seems to have formed between them, Ellie being actively hostile to all of Joel's attempts to speak to her. One day, a group of people led by a woman named Abby approaches Jackson with a vaguely stated mission and by happenstance get what they came for fairly easily: Joel. It's revealed the doctor beside Ellie in the operating table back in the first game was Abby's father, and since Joel murdered him in cold blood and basically killed the Fireflies as a movement, she's deeply pissed, traumatized, and wants revenge. Again, by sheer coincidence, Ellie arrives just as Abby is done torturing Joel and kills him in front of her before conking Ellie unconscious and leaving, her mission completed. This was a very bold move. To kill one of the previous game's protagonists, which I'm told is a very beloved character by the fanbase, was a very ballsy choice, and when details of this choice leaked to the public ahead of the game's release, a lot of people were pissed. But then the rest of the game is a drawn-out 20-hour romp about the extremely obvious message of revenge is a miserable path that will cost you too much and you'll feel like it was not worth it in the end, alongside the usual violence only begets violence, which is further driven home by forcing the player to commit several extremely graphic and sometimes gratuitously cruel acts of violence against other people, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Ellie gets pissed and wants to track Abby down in Seattle for revenge, followed by her recent girlfriend Dina, who's pregnant from her previous relationship with this guy, which also sets out on their trail so he can convince both that it's not worth it to risk their lives and the safety of their commune over this. Also, it turns out there's a full-on war going on between two factions: the Washington Liberation Front, colloquially called Wolves, a rebel militia that managed to overthrow the federal regime in Seattle, and the Seraphites, colloquially called Scars, a cult-like faction of anti-technology people. Ellie learns Abby is a wolf and hunts her down, finding and murdering her friends along the way with varying degrees of self-satisfaction, like that one time she kills a pregnant woman. Halfway through the game, perspectives change and we play as Abby, and I just want to say, the game was very lauded for the structure and I was like, really? Wasn't that obvious from the very beginning? Abby was heavily featured in promotional material, we play as her for a while during the intro, the game is obviously going for this theme of we keep killing ourselves out of anger, but what if the other side are normal human beings with their own reasons too? Obviously, at some point, we'd play and watch the story from Abby's side. This is not a new concept. Part 2 does it pretty much as expected, and I just saw so many people just floored by this artistic choice, building empathy for a character we're supposed to hate for half the game and her friends who were obviously not particularly sadistic. I mean, shit, the intro even heavily telegraphs most of them don't even want to be there doing this revenge bullshit with Abby, so come on. You guys really didn't see that coming? Am I just too cynical for my own overexposure to fiction writing tropes and techniques? Anyway, turns out Abby is not so bad. She had her reasons, like her father's murder and all the consequences of it, and she's also not particularly fond of the way the wolves are running things, because they're also rather authoritarian and violent like Fedra was. Plus, her lover Owen is missing and she decides to go looking for him against the wolves' orders to stay put. This naturally leads her into a variety of situations where she has to deal with the scars, and she comes across a trans boy who's ostracized by his lunatic peers. They form an unlikely bond that makes her go, huh, maybe we should be nicer to one another after all, while killing everybody all of the time and almost crossing paths with Ellie on several occasions and finding out her friends were murdered by her. You see, the thing about The Last of Us Part 2 is that it is Part 1, but more. Not particularly better, just it's more. The areas in which you must hide and pick out enemies one by one are now huge, so you spend at least 20 minutes per skirmish before going to the next cutscene or quote-unquote immersive slow-walking conversation sections. You can craft more shit now, but the economy surrounding resources and how much you realistically can craft and where you'd best use it stay the same. The gameplay still consists of slower stealth sections and sometimes cover shooting if you're feeling spicy, and it takes so long to get through it. Around 20 hours spread across 2 mirror campaigns where little of interest happens and you're constantly hit with the blunt and extremely clear message that revenge is bad, we should give other people the benefit of the doubt, maybe violence isn't always justified, there's cool people on both sides, and so on and so forth. It all finally culminates in Abby confronting Ellie. After killing this dude unceremoniously, and Abby wins the scuffle. Changed by the unexpected epiphany that revenge is a never-ending cycle, she lets Ellie go with a simple,
"Don't ever let me see you again." Come on.
and that's when the game should end. It somehow doesn't. As if the point needed to be further driven home, Abby and Lev go on a quest to flee the never-ending conflict and start a new life, only to be snatched by random, never-before-mentioned, and completely unredeemable slavers. Ellie goes back to Jackson to live with Dina and her newborn baby, and learns that Abby is still alive at this enslavement camp and can't let go of her obsessive, self-harming desire for closure and her revenge. So she sets out to risk her life again so she can kill her target, who's already as good as that in the hands of unapologetically sadistic weirdos. After almost dying and blowing a bunch of shit up, she finally finds an extremely frail and abused Abby and starts having second thoughts about this whole revenge business, but of course decides that fist-fighting Abby on the beach is still a very necessary thing to do. And this time, she wins, but decides that drowning Abby and getting her revenge may not bring her any joy or peace after all. She lets Abby and Lev go and sits alone and injured at the beach. She comes back to her home and finds Dina is gone because this last stint was the final straw for her. And if you somehow still didn't get how pointless it is to obsess over revenge, Ellie had 2 of her left fingers bitten off in her last scuffle with Abby, so she's now unable to play the guitar, her last and most special connection to Joel lost forever because she just couldn't let it go a little sooner. We get a cool scene that quite frankly should have just happened way earlier of Ellie and Joel's last conversation before his death. Ellie learned Joel was lying to her in a flashback halfway through her side of the story and acted hostile toward him because of this. In this scene, she brings herself to talk about it with him once more. He says he regrets nothing, and she says she doesn't know if she can forgive him,
But I would like to try.
and the game ends. While it wasn't met with quite as much universal acclaim from audiences as the first one, mostly because it came out during what I consider the beginnings of the culture war look out for the woke bullshit, where grown men were too busy getting pissy over Abby being jacked, a trans character existing, and harassing Abby's voice actress over the actions of a fictional character she portrayed, it was still widely regarded as a crowning achievement in gaming by critics, a big and beautiful example of how games are art that can deeply touch the soul, a masterpiece of brutal and mature storytelling, and I was scratching my head at what exactly was I missing. At the end of the day, a lot of this obviously comes down to my biases and preferences, but back then there was this weird feeling toward these games in my heart of hearts that I couldn't exactly articulate. Something about their existence and success as products bothered me. Something other than just saltiness over my weeb shit being less popular. popular, something I glimpsed in other Western games but was undistilled in The Last of Us. And then they made an HBO TV series adaptation, and it all fell into place. The TV show came out, and it was a hit. I watched it, and I realized that despite it still being essentially the same tropey and played out story, I was enjoying it. I was seeing the value others apparently saw in it as a story about the relationship between this broken father and lost daughter. I was interested by its world building, the way that supporting characters actually had time to be fleshed out, that previously faceless cannon fodder goons were actually turned into characters here and there. The fact I was watching scenes that were filmed in intentional ways as to be engaging and interesting to a passive viewer, not an interactive one. The way the plot flowed from episode to episode, scene to scene, uninterrupted by uninspired gameplay that forced me to stop appreciating all the cinematic wazoo going on. It was then that I realized that this fucking thing should have been a movie, or in this case a TV series, all along. The Last of Us was simply not at all interested in being a video game that used its medium to tell its story. It wanted to be a prestige Oscar-winning movie, but was forced to cram the semblance of a game on top in order to justify itself as one. The single best thing this TV show adaptation does that drastically improves the experience is allowing scenes outside the perspective of the main characters. In the games, because of the immersiveness, the plot sticks exclusively to the perspective of its playable characters. Every flashback is a playable character dreaming or reminiscing about a previous memory. Every piece of dialogue is delivered by or to the playable characters. Every piece of world building or simply supporting stories that don't involve the immediate concerns of the playable characters are relayed in notes and letters and journals scattered about the scenery for you to find and read at your leisure, because that's the only way to present non-essential plot information if you set this hard rule for your game, by making it so that a lot of people were really into journaling and conveniently left a bunch of it behind wherever you pass through. With luck, the playable character's POV would sometimes separate from each other, and you could get some ping-ponging of scenes, but that was it. The TV series has flashbacks that are dramatically placed in points simply because they are an important bit of the story that's cool to see and relevant to what will happen next. It has scenes involving other characters and what they're up to away from Joel and Ellie. Other people besides those the player controls and sees through the protagonists exist and have conversations that flesh out their characters, their factions, the world they live in without the need for gameplay contrivances. The Last of Us in this format feels free from its shackles as an immersive interactive cinematic game, being just what it craved to be all along, a not interactive, carefully constructed piece of audiovisual media. In my opinion, it's simply better on all accounts, at least all those that matter, and when there were different artistic choices regarding the characters or plot details, they were done so in a way that simply made it much more interesting to watch unfold. The cannibal guy is now a much more reserved, disturbingly calm and composed figure instead of obvious stranger danger sleazeball, with scenes portraying the way he controls his frail community into submission, for example. Hell, Bill is now a character, an actual character. And yeah, no, whatever the culture war dipshits have to say about it, you're not convincing me Bill was a memorable and extremely important character that was butchered in the name of woke. I didn't even remember who he fucking was when I watched the episode and had to Google it to make sure he wasn't just an original character or something. You're telling me you care about Bill, the angry libertarian asshat who's a closeted homosexual and fills up runtime only for you to find out his lover ran from him and killed himself because he was so insufferable? This Bill is essential to the plot of The Last of Us Part 1? Really? Or maybe you're just a homophobe that couldn't stomach an entire episode about actual characters having a gay relationship and die on their own terms in this fucked up world, and you need to pretend the way things happen for this particular section of the game was actually super important and essential to the plot that changing it so much made it quote-unquote pointless. Yeah, right. Fucking Bill. I quite frankly have no notes when it comes to Season 1. It does what it needs to do well, it expands in all the right areas, and all changes were for the best. And then came Season 2 and... I I think it was pretty good too. For some reason, people really criticized the season, which is half the story of part 2. And it's another one of those moments where I feel like an alien because I'm like, it's fine? It essentially did the same thing season 1 did to part 2. The story is pretty much the same. Whatever changes are there are a bunch of new scenes that I very much appreciate. The first episode, for example, shows what life is like in Jackson more thoroughly, and I really like these scenes of Joel with the therapist whose husband he killed after the guy was bit. The palpable tension in this unstable woman as she says she hates his guts but is still willing to go through with the sessions is just a very nice, humanizing touch. Same thing with the way the series portrays the ongoing conflict between the wolves and scars. The game itself used this conflict as an excuse to justify more hostile NPCs being thrown at you, so you'd have a game to play, especially on Abby's side of the campaign, but I quite frankly felt like that part of the conflict was very tangential. I think that's the word, back when I played. Like, the wolves themselves don't really matter, as opposed to Abby's immediate circle of friends, which are all ex-Fireflies, so they're not particularly invested in the organization they're a part of anyway. Remember Isaac, the leader of the wolves? I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. He appears like twice during the whole game and dies unceremoniously, barely a character, but here he has a few more scenes to shine and, you know, exist. The scars are also just kinda there. Unless you read all the letters and logs and notes left around the place, you get little to no information on them in the story itself, outside of the fact that they're all violent and primitive-like, and they kill the wolves with overwhelming violence, and they're bigots because of Lev. Apparently, their original founder and subject of worship was a radical pacifist, but over time the organization forgot about that because of undisclosed reasons. In the series, we get a few extra scenes with insights about the ongoing conflict that helps the Seraphites set in as a part of this universe. Though to be fair, they're still mostly the savages archetype. But damn, a lot of people really had things to say about this one, and a major complaint were the deviations from the source material, which I'm like, okay? It's not really cutting or actually, you know, changing the essential plot beats in any real way. It's mostly adding stuff which I think goes a long way of fleshing out the characters in its world that the games never did outside of a bunch of notes. But apparently this by itself becomes a problem for many people because it portrays characters differently, I personally disagree, or over-explains moral ambiguities from the original, another hard disagree from me. The only sorta big complaint I have with Season 2 is that Bella Ramsey doesn't really convince me that her character has grown 4 years since the last season. She still looks younger. And Abby's casting choice was weird because, you know, the original character is buff and tall, and for some reason they went with an actress that's neither, but whatever. While I personally hold no attachment to the way the original game did things, so I don't mind deviations, extra flashbacks and the like, I feel like the fact that all these things exist in order to fill out a paltry 7-episode count for the whole season sorta proves my point that at the end of the day, The Last of Us Part 2 doesn't have much of an actual story to tell. The game takes about 20 hours to roll credits because it is padded to hell and back by long gameplay skirmishes in order to justify itself as a video game. Once you carve those out, and the need to have the plot justify why it's showing you walking from one area to another in detail, there's just not much there. If you're going to ape the game's narrative structure of having 2 sequential major perspectives, you just don't have much to fill a version of this that doesn't get to have the interactive padding. Which brings me to the major lost opportunity of this adaptation, in my opinion. The single best thing they could have done for Part 2 would have been to make it so both protagonists' parallel stories are shown simultaneously, but they didn't do that. We got 7 episodes of Ellie, and whenever the current production landscape for TV sorts itself out, and if the sale of Warner Bros. Doesn't result in further delays or cancellation, we will get presumably another 7 episodes of Abby and hopefully that ending stretch. The one thing that I think seriously hampered the storytelling of the second game outside its game elements has been retained, and that's why I ultimately decided not to wait for the series to end before making this video. I mean, Do you really expect them to change anything? Season 3 will just be Abby's side of the plot from the game beat for beat, and maybe not even featuring expanded content and scenes after the audience's reaction to the previous season. They didn't have the guts to change anything substantial, despite what purists claim until now, so why should I believe they'll do anything to meaningfully alter the experience here when people got angry that the final scene of the game was actually placed in the penultimate episode of Season 2? And I genuinely think that scene is better written and directed than its game counterpart. Season 3 won't change anything. It'll be, at the absolute best, the same thing as Seasons 1 and 2. The real version of these games, unimpeded by the limitations of a medium they don't really want to be in. Neil Druckmann is the main creative force behind the Last of Us franchise and Naughty Dog as a whole for at least the last decade. Given his body of work, I would not be surprised if the guy went to film school or something and through circumstance found himself exerting his craft on video games, but that's not his story at all. He has stated and shown numerous times how much he has a clear love for video games as a medium. While career-wise he started out as a novelist, he had clear intentions of working with games specifically, majored in entertainment technologies, got himself an internship at Naughty Dog, and cut his teeth in the industry doing programming, localization tools, and general game design work. As he grew within the company, he clearly gravitated towards the more purely creative side of game development, meaning writing, creative directing, original concept development, etc. A position that got solidified and defined his career once The Last of Us came out to massive success. He often cites adventure games of old, such as The Secret of Monkey Island, as his biggest references, meaning he's a very storytelling-oriented individual when it comes to games, and that's actually more than okay and totally valid. I myself am someone that places a huge weight over the story for games I play. I generally enjoy genres that are all about having a narrative first and foremost, sometimes having little to no interactivity, or at least less than what you'd expect from the usual video game. To me, the story is what gives context to your experience within that game, and that context is a major incentive for me to see a point in playing through it, so yeah, I get where Neil is coming from here, and all the more power to him. No, my problems with Druckmann's approach to video games are a bit deeper than that. Something that maybe he himself may not be aware of, or maybe he is, I don't know. But my problem is that his games seem to be falling into the cultural trap that has questioned video games' value as an art form since basically forever. That video games are perceived as kid-friendly, plotless, shallow, deep entertainment, and in order to prove their worth, they must be like the other, relatively new art form that everyone agrees is the big boys' league. Movies. The movie language, especially from the early 2000s onwards, has been deeply coveted by both TV and video games. The cultural notion that mature and worthwhile entertainment can only come from offerings that have a hard to properly describe but immediately recognizable cinematic style. Grittiness, dialogue-heavy, wide aspect ratio, film grain effects, supporting orchestral soundtrack, and a grand but very much realistic tale about the human condition. That's what the real connoisseurs want. If you want your new little medium about jumping over obstacles or shooting people to matter, you have to do that. The so-called second golden age of television started not simply because of the serial storytelling quality that sprung up from that period of time, mostly from HBO, but because series began to overtly attempt to look like movies, featuring the same production values and general aesthetic expected from the big screen. Soap operas? Teen dramas? That's cheap TV bullshit. Get out of here. The Sopranos looks like The Godfather but spaced out into several episodes. Game of Thrones is like a bunch of little Lord of the Rings movies. In a similar way that TV, more specifically serialized fiction, had to fight for prestige by incorporating film aesthetics and production values, so have games. As soon as technology for rendering graphics and applying broad movie-like systems of presentation improved far enough, games have attempted to translate cinema language into their titles. Games began to have long, meticulously directed directed cutscenes, debates conflating the quality of any given game to how detailed and realistic its graphics were dominated discourse from time to time, features that existed at first because of hardware limitations but became a part of video game language began to be scrapped in favor of more parity with reality, of immersiveness, of mature presentation and storytelling. And even then, it wasn't enough. For whatever cultural factors I don't have the time nor the knowledge to properly look into in order to say this video essay is well researched or whatever, video games were, and to some extent are still, perceived as less than whatever art forms are the most prestiged, stuff one should grow out of, a lowly hobby for kids and teens, and, when politicians feel like finding a scapegoat and wasting everyone's time, a vehicle for mentally unstable teenagers to commit real-world violence. Just look at this recent podcast between Druckmann and Alex Garland, an English novelist, screenwriter, and film director.
As a gamer, I had thought that they were a good vehicle for narrative, proper narrative, adult narrative, as much sophistication as you'd find in a book or a film. And there was, for a long time, a kind of received wisdom within the game industry that I was aware of. It was essentially anti-narrative. Narrative belongs to other mediums. What's special about our medium is that it doesn't have narrative. There's two games that I see as having absolutely just fully demonstrating that narrative is fully within the gift of video games. It was Last of Us and BioShock, which had proper narrative twists within it, as well as themes and sort of like a political discussion.
Democracy is just a filler for textbooks.
Despite a bunch of evidence to the contrary, this is the image that many people, most notably creative intellectuals, have about video games. And to be fair to Neil,
I never bought into that. I grew up on like a lot of these Sierra adventure games, so like some of my favorite narratives were in games.
But still, I believe what he did with The Last of Us, and to a smaller extent the Uncharted franchise, also by Naughty Dog, wasn't proved to Garland likes the value and potential of video games as storytelling devices by its own terms, but translate the prestige, language, and aesthetics they already enjoy and value into a video game form in a way that's palatable and easily recognizable. Garland gushes about how incredible The Last of Us is, how it changed his view on video games, how this opens up so many venues of storytelling, all the while not particularly focusing on the bits that make a game, well, a game. You know, gameplay elements, the design, unique usage of the possibilities of the medium itself, etc. He's constantly glazing The Last of Us over its storytelling alone, understanding it not as its own thing in a different medium, but as another type of movie, and therefore worthy of real respect and consideration. There's even this bit where Neil talks about how he feels pressured into not doing too long cutscenes because he assumes players will be bored and want to get in on the action, even though there's several examples of games that feature little action and a lot of story. And here's the thing, I think Neil understands, deep down as a gamer, what I'm talking about here. He's aware that the way he's presenting these games implies the need to have action sequences to justify them as games, even though he'd personally like not to lean on interactive action set pieces so much. Presenting your games as movie adjacent, featuring gunplay, stealth, and crafting mechanics. He knows from his own experiences with the medium that games can be more than just realistic looking movies. But this is what has worked. This is what brings in the money and prestige. This is what gets him several awards for best storytelling in video games. This is what allows him extremely big resources to keep bringing his creative projects to life. In order to become a lauded creative game designer, at least over here in the West it seems, you need to make your games look and feel like gritty, mature, realistic, expensive Hollywood films. And that is why, regardless of whether I'm right on my speculation on Neil Druckmann's inner thoughts, I think The Last of Us as a whole signals the death of creativity in video games. Or, you know, at least in the AAA production sphere. When games that want to be movies like The Last of Us are the gold standard of video games, the kind of project that by far gets the most visibility, the biggest budgets, wide access to bleeding-edge tech, and nigh universal cultural acclaim, that means the market will naturally follow the scent and calcify the genre as the only worthwhile investment. At least when it comes to single player, AAA developers will gravitate, or perhaps be pressured by shareholders, into these tendencies or risk risk losing money. Western games, in particular, are seen less and less like their own medium, where ingenuity and creativity within its own language and aesthetics are rewarded, but are more like conduits to lead gamers into becoming a new brand of cinephile. Take the recent God of War duology. Now, to be perfectly clear, I like these games. Not my all-time favorites by any means, but they do feature more robust gameplay mechanics meant to have you engage with it as a game, certainly more than The Last of Us ever brought to the table, and its central gimmick is that it has a camera that never cuts away from the shot, because of course. Unbroken shots are one of the tricks filmmakers get the most horny about because of how tricky it is to pull off, so the whole game is a continuous, supposedly immersive shot, which can't feature loading screens because those would be too video gamey, so into several crevices we go. Red Dead Redemption, most notably 2, is about a western spaghetti movie you can play, and Uncharted is the same, but for blockbuster action films. These are the kinds of projects that tend to get the biggest spotlight, the biggest budgets, the biggest press, become synonymous with the idea of gaming, and in my opinion, severely limit the creative potential of the mainstream gaming industry. Nowadays, when we look for originality, something a little bit different from this kind of thing in Western single-player games, we usually go to indies, smaller titles, oftentimes with a retro aesthetic because that's what's possible to do with a much smaller budget, and yet such titles are usually brimming with more originality, creativity, style, and passion, even when we only consider storytelling and not all the other aspects of game design. You know why? Well, for a lot of reasons that have to do with the late capitalism hellscape we find ourselves in currently. But one of the big reasons is because most of these games aren't trying to be movies. Sure, they couldn't even if they wanted to, but they embrace their presentation limitations and do a lot with a little. Sometimes even stuff I genuinely believe can only be done on video games. They are not trying to convince you of their worth through adopting the identity of a more generally lauded medium. They are trying to be good games that do gamified shit and present their story in whatever way is both possible and thematically appropriate with the rest of the game. As a bit of an aside, at least when it comes to the AAA space, I generally feel like the Japanese market doesn't suffer from this obsession with cinematic language as much. I mean, sure, that's probably me being biased, but the genres often associated with Japanese developers tend to embrace more ludic and stylized approaches that embrace the fact that those are games. Hell, even Hideo Kojima, an ostensibly movie buff that arguably created this idea that games could be a lot like movies back in the PlayStation 1, that puts movie references everywhere he can and currently literally works with Hollywood actors in his products, still produces games that feature robust gameplay systems designed to enhance the themes of his stories and engage or surprise you with meta pranks despite featuring 40-minute-long cutscenes.
Maybe it was from old age.
You mean he kicked the bucket in the middle of a battle?
Well, except that one. That one is basically just a very big movie, I'll concede that. All of this to say, The Last of Us doesn't need to be a game, and games don't need to be movies. For all the ways quote-unquote gamers are so passionate about how video games are an incredible, different, and respectable new medium, they are really quick to value games more when they attempt to wear the skin of another art form if it means their hobby and passion will be treated better by massive air quotes here, okay? Normies.
Adult narrative.
It's okay to not be a movie. It's also okay to make games inspired by movies. That's how art works after all. But when you make games whose primary goal is to be a movie in itself, that's when I think we have a problem. Video game language, just like cinema and TV, has been developed organically through its early limitations, but for some reason we seem to be afraid of those, too quick to consider them a necessary stepping stone that needs to be discarded now that we can be cinematic. And the ultimate result of this is a market that stifles itself, and we get major games like these, which are better served as fucking movies or TV series or even novels, what have you. The Last of Us isn't doing anything particularly new or groundbreaking, yet we treat it as if it was the second coming of Christ for video games simply because we get to show our grandparents or something how games are closer to something they recognize and respect. Hell, a literal year after the release of the first game, Neil Druckmann was already involved in writing a movie adaptation. Is it any wonder that eventually this HBO series was made and it works better than the game? Now, to be completely fair, it's not like more gamified games aren't also being prestiged. It's not like the games industry is on the verge of creative collapse, though very much so a financial one, or there's no options that follow my personal preferences, but when titles such as this essentially become one, if not the biggest face of gaming, I can't help but feel like we're doing something wrong. It's not that it doesn't have any value, and all the more power to anyone who deeply enjoys it, but I can't help just going, really? This is the masterpiece? One of the best games of all time? A movie? The Last of Us puts me in this weird position where I get to say, unironically, that the TV series feels like the original and the games are the adaptation. Do we really need to put that kind of product of all things at a pedestal? Shouldn't we demand something more than cinema looking from what we consider the pinnacle of gaming? Maybe I'm just being salty. Maybe it's just because the stuff I usually like is more niche. Who knows?